Nigel Barker joins me in Studio Q. Hello, Nigel.
Hi, how are you?
Not too bad. Diversity in the fashion industry, runaway or catalog work, has been a very hot topic over the past couple of years. You write in this book that models hold up a mirror to society.
Mm-hmm.
Is it an accurate mirror?
No, absolutely. Listen, I think that really, in many respects, when you see fashion magazines, when we look at models, when we see what's going on in media in general, even if we don't like it, even if we are upset by what we see, or we argue against what's going on, it is because it's a mirror of how society is. It's and also in many respects the conversations that are started because of these are perhaps our grievances with what's happening in fashion, whether it's body image or ethnicity. At least the conversation gets started, and in many respects that's how the zeitgeist of the time is read, and also how it's changed.
Okay. You write about how you found acceptance in the fashion industry after growing up in London as an ethnically mixed child who looked, quote unquote, different through the 70s and 80s. Tell me a bit about that experience.
Well, I mean, to put some clarity to that, I am part Sri Lankan, right? So, and growing up in the 70s in England, there were very few children that were part half and half anything, or you were either from one ethnicity or another. It's really something of the past sort of 20 years. I'm one of the very first children in many respects who was part one thing and part the other, partly because the world was a much sort of bigger place in a way back then. People weren't mixing, they weren't coming over in the same numbers as they do have now, and obviously people are now the offspring of many sort of interracial marriages. But when you grow up as a kid in England, and I went to a very sort of conservative boarding school, I was the only child of any color whatsoever. So people every day ask me, so why are you brown and where are you from? And when you're born in a country, you look in the mirror and you say, well, I'm from here. But then, of course, and I sound like I'm from here. And I obviously everyone felt that I wasn't. So I guess coming into the fashion industry for the very first time, it was such a group of outcasts. The fashion industry has a lot of people from, all over the world, all different kinds of sexuality, all different types of creative individuals. And really they find themselves in many respects almost like a homecoming when they get into the fashion business, because they're not judged ever really by their color or their sexuality, but rather by their talent and their effort to collaborate.
Growing up in that experience as a kid, was it tough? Was it tough being kind of the only person who wasn't, quote unquote, white?
There were times when it was tough. But it wasn't that I had a hard and I was bullied specifically. Rather, there were moments when I got bullied. But if you look at me, I'm a 6'4", 220-pound guy.
You're a big young fella. Yeah.
So I was lucky, and I've been this height since I was 14. So and I was a pretty good rugby player. So luckily, I took care of most of that business early on.
Is that right?
But nonetheless, there was definitely a time when, regardless, you still question yourself. So there's an identity crisis that happens in children, regardless of whether they're bullied or not, purely because they want to find out who they are. And we're all on a sort of a voyage of self-discovery, whether we like it or not, in many different ways. And that's just another layer.
Okay, well, how do you reconcile your experience in the fashion industry with the continued criticisms that it's not as diverse as it should be?
Well, and that is not just the fashion industry, and I think that's where we go back to this mirror issue, is that, diversity, whether it's, women in the workplace or equality with women or ethnicity or shape or size or the subject of, are we obese as a nation or are we not? All these sort of controversial subjects that we discuss constantly in media, they are mirrored in fashion, and we see them there all the time. And are we making headway? I'd like to think that we are. Are we doing it quick enough? Probably not. But that's also partly due to us, right? Why is it that the very first time sort of a full-figured model is sort of really celebrated in a very popular magazine, Sports Illustrated, for the first time now? It's a bit ironic that it happens to be a men's magazine, not a women's magazine. And ultimately it's because men demanded it. Men actually like voluptuous women, and want to see them in Sports Illustrated. And so the editors know that, they put them in. Women have to want to see themselves in those magazines. And I think now more than ever with social media, they can demand it.
Okay, just going back for a second. Your book takes a look at 50 of the most influential models. You profile many models, including the groundbreaking figures we talked about, like China Machado.
You're not going to get it right.
Machado?
We should move on to another one.
Naomi Sims. That's
Naomi Sims. There you go.
Now, Naomi is often credited as the first African-American model to work for mainstream magazines. How hard was it for models like these two to break through then in the 50s and 60s?
I mean, Naomi Sims' story is magnificent, really. I mean, it's a story of absolutely, her dedication to basically being seen, being noticed, and standing up for women of color. In 1967, she came of age to become a model. She's extraordinary looking, 5'11", stunning, gorgeous complexion. Went to the agencies, got turned down one after the other. No, we don't need any black models. No, we have a black model. No, we're not interested in you. She, didn't take the rejection. She went to the photographers and said, "Would you like to test shoot me?" And many of the photographers noticed a beautiful woman, great bone structure, said absolutely. One of those photographers got her a job doing the cover of the New York Times style supplement. She then took that tear sheet. She went to one of the leading model agencies of the time, Wilhelmina, and said, "Would you, take me on?" Wilhelmina said, "No," right? But nonetheless, she said, "How about this? Even if you won't take me on, I want to be sort of legitimized as a model. How about I send my tear sheets out under your name? If I get a job, I'll give you the job. You don't have to do anything. I'll just give it to you." And she did this. And Women's Home Journal, 2 weeks later, called up and put her on the cover of their magazine, which was the very first time an African-American woman had been on the cover of a national magazine in America in 1967. And that very same year, AT&T booked her for a TV commercial. That was the first time a black woman had been on a national television commercial in America, both in 1967. And this is a woman who wasn't even represented, who fought to be represented and did her own, acted as an agent for herself.
And still paid someone else the commission.
Okay,
let's talk about your own mother. She was a model for a number of years as well, and I'm curious what her experience is as someone of mixed heritage. As you said, you're half Sri Lankan, half non-Sri Lankan. I don't know, British. What's your other half?
My other half is a sort of combination of English and Irish and Scottish, I think.
So you're a Newfoundlander, essentially.
Pretty much, exactly. You and I have something in common, despite many other things. But no, listen, my mother is also half Sri Lankan, so I'm actually only a quarter Sri Lankan.
Okay.
My mother, it was even more diverse. If you can imagine at the time, 1950s, 1960s, being half and half was literally unheard of. I mean, my grandmother, when she married my grandfather and had my mother, was cast out of the family in Sri Lanka. And by the way, this goes both ways. It's not just the white aspect saying you shouldn't marry a Sri Lankan. It's the Sri Lankans saying you shouldn't marry that white man. We don't want that white blood either. So it went both ways. And it was our Sri Lankan family that cast my grandmother out of the family. Now, she had two children. She had my aunt and my mother. My mother started modeling. And in 1960, she entered the Miss Sri Lanka contest, a part of the Miss World pageant. And she won, right? Only to have her title taken away from her. Why? Because she was only half Sri Lankan, and back then you had to be 100%. Think how we've changed. What does 100% even mean these days?
You're obviously well respected in the industry as a leader from the television show, and obviously as a photographer.
Okay.
What influence do you have to help change that?
Well, certainly on shows like America's Next Top Model, we did our best to make a difference. And obviously my new show with Naomi Campbell, working with models who have spent their life, really opening doors for models of color, ethnicity. And certainly on America's Next Top Model, we had a petite, cycle. We had a full-figured cycle, And if you look at America's Next Top Model, the interesting thing is when we first started, we were very out of vogue. It wasn't popular with fashion people. It was very popular with the public. And most magazines and people in fashion laughed at us and said, "This isn't real. This isn't this isn't how fashion is." And of course, 10 years later, Italian Vogue was our magazine sponsor. Andre Leontali, editor-at-large of American Vogue, was a judge.
So the industry caught up.
They caught up, and obviously they embraced the fact that the people, the public, liked the change and they liked the diversity.
Did you feel any pressure? Your book, Models of Influence, it does reflect a lot of the status quo, the most influential models over the past 50 years, but did you feel any pressure to shake that up when you were putting your book together?
No, I mean, I was trying to be honest as possible. I mean, it's not always, you don't always like what you see, and you often think that things should be perhaps different. But this is, this is a historical reference book more than anything, and anecdotal stories, certainly from my life working with many of these women. But also there are women who I haven't worked with and whose stories that I found were quite extraordinary and interesting and fascinating, who, you didn't realize where they came from and what the pivotal moment was and how that thing actually happened. And sometimes, we take everything for granted. We always do. It's only a moment later after anything cracks on the news that we sort of are used to it and over it and think, well, of course it's normal for women to be able to have their hair short, when actually it was people like Twiggy in the 60s who sort of ruffled her hair and cut her hair short and ran around looking sort of boyish, tomboyish, that caused a revolution, and literally the swinging 60s and the Beatles and that whole area of rebellion and individualism was, Twiggy personified it, and she was like sort of a cult hero.
Right. The fashion industry has been making headlines lately for broadening their beauty standards. During New York Fashion Week this year, actor Jamie Brewer, who has Down syndrome, walked the runway for designer Carrie Hammer. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, we were talking about one of those before, featured for the first time a, quote, plus-size model, Robin Lawley. Those are just a few examples. How optimistic are you that these individual choices are a sign of lasting change in the industry?
Well, I think sometimes, just seeing yourself once gives another Down syndrome child or somebody else with whatever their issue or the reason why they're a minority, then they see themselves that one time. That kid growing up goes, well, maybe I could too. Maybe I could be president. Maybe I could walk on a runway. Maybe I could do this. And so that opportunity sets, balls in motion that it's hard to tell. And, that's how the way the world works. And if no one ever gave anyone a chance and said, oh, well, it's just a one-off every single time, is your glass half full or half empty? And I think that's, I like to think that we have to be positive and we have to, strive for change. But we also need to continue pushing. We can't just sit back on our laurels and say, oh, well, now that's happened. We're fine. We represented. It's all done.
After so many years of talking about this issue, why do we have so much further to go in terms of improvement? Where do you think the most resistance comes from, in your point of view?
I think it comes from us. I think, we are our own worst enemy. We all sort of love to sort of say we want to see more, we need to see more of this, we're not represented. But, the reality is, even with, say, for example, full-figured models, there's lots of evidence where, stores and what have you put in full-figured departments in their stores, and women don't shop there. They don't, there've been full-figured magazines. Women don't buy them. They still aspire to magazines where people put skinny young girls on the cover. If you want to be represented, then you have to, purchase, be a part of it, and be a part of the movement. And I think that now more than ever, with social media, we are beginning to see that, because people follow, and get interested in whoever, whether it be, a Kate Upton, for example, and with her Dougie video, and then her Cat Daddy video, and people loving it, and making a big fuss of her, and of course, she has to back it up with, still being interesting after the fact, so, same with someone like a Cara Delevingne, 15 million followers on Instagram. And why is that? Is it, the fact that she's just pretty? Or is it her story and her life story and her personality, things that perhaps are more interesting and more intriguing, those inner beauty qualities that actually are really what makes someone charismatic. And so the story is changing. It's becoming less perhaps about, your diversity, and more about your personality. Is that diverse enough? And I think that's an interesting thing too. And that social media is a big, powerful player in that.
What do you think about the opening of new markets, like in China and Latin America, for instance? Do they contribute to the industry's need, or the opposite in terms of diversity or the world's notions of beauty?
Well, the world has become a much smaller place. There was no doubt in sort of the beginnings of the 2000s, end of the 90s, we began to see models from Brazil, models from South America, models from Eastern Europe, beginning to see models from China. And that's partly because dictatorships were collapsing, the Eastern Bloc was opening up, and certainly China was becoming a little bit more relaxed with travel and what have you. And also in places like China, where the economies are booming and there's a new nouveau riche sort of society gathering steam, and they also want to be recognized, and they want to be seen. And we saw this happen in Europe in the 80s and what have you, where the young rich wanted look at me clothing, and they wanted to be to see themselves in the ads, and they wanted in, and this is what's happening in China. And so now you're getting Chinese models, where for a long time Chinese, even in their own magazines, we were looking at Caucasian women. They weren't seeing Chinese, they wanted to be Western. Now all of a sudden they're comfortable with themselves again and saying, okay, now I want to see a Chinese person, please.
How does it affect male models when when we're talking about issues of diversity and representation? How does it translate to men?
That's a very good question, and I think that's probably the largest booming area of the business. I mean, I think that the male modeling, there's no doubt when anyone talks about a male model, it's sort of a smile, gathers on someone's face, and they think of Zoolander, or they think of some kind of concept of the ridicule.
But you are ridiculously good looking.
Well, thank you very much. Ridiculously good looking. I've heard that before in my dreams. That for sure that those sorts of quotes and that aspect of male modeling, I think, has put a lot of guys off getting involved with it. But the industry itself has boomed, and in the past 5 years, whether it's the barbershop world that's sort of taken over in men's beauty, that there are now more barbershops popping up that are cool and hipsterish everywhere, and from Los Angeles to New York to London to Toronto and everywhere else. So yeah, it's changing and it's booming.
Thanks, Nigel. Nigel Barker. He's the author of the new book titled Models of Influence. He joined me here in Studio Q. Thanks for coming, man.
Thanks, buddy.